to the House.
Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to take a call on this Trade, Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duties Amendment Bill. And as my colleagues have signalled, Labor is supporting this legislation, that we are keen to see this legislation go to Select Committee, and that some of the questions that have arisen in this debate, and I'm sure others that will be raised by submitters, can be teased out. Because, Mr. Speaker, as speakers before me have outlined, the purpose of this bill is to introduce a public interest test into New Zealand's anti-dumping and countervailing duties regime, and essentially this changes laws to allow goods into the country without duties imposed on it if it's considered that consumers will benefit. And, Mr. Speaker, that is the critical part of this legislation. It is about getting that balance right, about balancing how it is that a consumer will benefit from these changes against the need to protect local industries. And that's the debate that we're hearing in this House. We're saying that, what we don't want to see is our local industries destroyed, but we do need to put in place a regime that sees that consumers will benefit. And that is what the public interest test that is going to be introduced under this legislation will give us the tools to weigh up whether or not there is a public interest in this, whether or not that ordinary people, when they go down and look to purchase certain goods and materials, whether or not they are going to benefit from this. And there is a more general ability to do this, but it does point to the need, and my colleague David Cunliffe spoke about that in his contribution. There is specifically pointed to in the legislation an ability to do this in the period following a natural disaster. And I think that we do need to think about what happens to a supply chain when you have a rapid increase in demand and there is just no way that the local suppliers can meet that demand. And that's what we've seen in the case of the Christchurch rebuild. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's worth going back and thinking about the genesis of this legislation. That we know that the bill came out of the Productivity Commission's 2012 report on housing affordability, that's where this idea first came from. So this is a report that was presented to government in 2012, and here we are in 2016 debating this measure. Some could say that it's a little bit too late, and it's no wonder that we haven't done the things that we need to do to address the really real and critical issues of housing affordability, because this is 4 years on from the government being alerted that this is a measure. It's not a silver bullet, but it is a measure that could have been introduced to address some of those issues. What we did see that the government, there was the report to government directed MB to undertake a market-level study into the construction sector to identify barriers to improved housing affordability. And the regulatory impact statement that sits alongside this bill explains that MB identified tariffs and anti-dumping duties on residential construction materials as two barriers to competition and productivity. And it went on to give some specificity around those claims. So, Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that is born out of a particular need in our country at the moment. But after that report, it came through that there was another phase of some consultation, Mr. Speaker, where the public did have a chance to have their say on some measures that were going to be introduced under this legislation. And one of the things that came through really clearly in that public consultation that was carried out throughout 2014 when the discussion paper was released, that there were a range of opinions. 20 submissions were received on the discussion paper, 13 submitters expressed support for the status quo, while 7 submitters supported the adoption of the public interest test. And a range of questions were raised in these submissions, whether or not these were people who were supporting the status quo or the submitters who actually did want to see the introduction of a public interest test. And they're questions that the Select Committee will need to consider when it goes before that committee. One will be, Mr. Speaker, around the limits of the test. What are the parameters that we're putting in place and whether it's fit for purpose in order to address the issues that have been spelled out that it's trying to address in in the legislation. And what we learn from the legislation in terms of when it is being investigated whether the imposition of a duty is in the public interest, the chief executive of the relevant government department which administers the bill must investigate the following issues. They must look at the effect of the duty on the price of the dumped or subsidised goods. They must look at the effect of the duty on the prices of like goods produced in New Zealand. So this very much is having a look at what the impact of making these changes will do to our local industries. They must look at the effect of the duty on the choice of availability of like goods. They must look at the effect of the duty on product and service quality. They must look at the effect of the duty on the financial viability of the domestic industry. So we can see that many of these tests actually are there to ensure that we don't destroy our domestic industries in the process. They must look at the effect of the duty on employment levels. And this is going to be a critical test, that we don't want to see goods coming in without the proper thought given to what it does to jobs here in New Zealand. Whether there's an alternative supply of like goods available, and any other factor the Chief Executive considers might be important. So they are going to be really important criteria for the Select Committee to consider. And I'm sure that the submitters who will submit on this legislation will address those. Are these the right criteria that we're putting in place for making these decisions? Are these the things, or are there more that should be considered when it's deciding whether or not to apply this legislation? Well, it will also need to be considered, Mr. Speaker, how this legislation and how the allowing these goods in will fit with our international obligations. And this was something that was raised when there was the call for public submissions in the discussion document. So I'm sure something the Select Committee will need to consider is how this fits within other trade agreements and the other objectives of the World Trade Organisation, of which we have part, and how New Zealand is seen to fulfil its obligations within there. As I've mentioned many times, one of the things that I'm sure the Select Committee will turn its mind to and give good consideration to when it appears in front of that group of parliamentarians is the impact on local industries, and that will be something. And one of the other issues, and there will be many, but another issue that I picked up from the regulatory impact statement that was raised in the initial round of consultation on the discussion document was the complexity to administer the rules that are put in place. That are we making a set of rules that it is possible, Mr. Speaker, for them to be administered and for them to be sure to be checked that they're being applied in a fair and even-handed way. So these are all questions which the Select Committee will turn its attentions to, and I'm sure that they will give due consideration to. Because, Mr. Speaker, these are really important questions that do need to be addressed. And I think that everybody knows that. But we do have to ensure that we are getting that balance right about making sure that our consumers are getting a fair deal, and making sure that our local industries are also receiving a fair deal. And I think we have a number of case studies that we can have a look what happens in a place like after a natural disaster like Christchurch, where you do have the normal demand and supply mechanisms severely upturned. But, Mr. Speaker, what we do have to realise here, that this legislation, while it seems sensible, and Labor's always happy to consider sensible trade legislation and consider it at Select Committee, that we're more than happy to do that, but we cannot kid ourselves that this is the big idea that we need in terms of how it is that we grow our economy and that we provide the kind of incomes that we need so that all New Zealanders can get a fair deal. This is not the big ideal that will get us exports reaching the government's goal of 40% of GDP. This is some tinkering around the edges. And, Mr. Speaker, we're happy to support this. We think there are questions and fishhooks that need to be addressed at Select Committee, and we certainly will play our part in that, Mr. Speaker.
I call Alfred Now.